Hey everyone, welcome to dot points A, 18, 19, and 20. And we're going to knock off 3 dot points in one here by doing the practice of mulesing and looking at welfare, legislation, and ethics of it. So if we have a look at the dot points, it says the first one is discuss factors that should be considered when carrying out a particular husbandry practice to reduce negative welfare impacts, such as the things we need to know are using appropriate equipment, skill of the operator, timing of the practice, and management of the animal after the practice. Then we need to discuss an ethical issue and relate it to animal production, such as mulesing, live export, etc. We only need to do one here, so we're doing mulesing. And lastly, we need to investigate animal welfare legislation or laws for a specific farm animal and discuss the implications here for this. So let's look at the first one. Basically, before we do that, we need to look at definitions. So in these 3 dot points, we're looking at ethics, welfare, and legal issues. So firstly, ethics. Ethics are basically moral principles that are applied to a procedure, and it involves what we consider to be right and wrong conduct. So ethics is going to be subjective. Different people have different ethical beliefs. So some people will think, for example, that caged eggs are okay, and some people will think it's not okay. So this is the kind of issue of ethics. It's not really a legal thing. The practices that we're talking about here might be legal, but some people think they're wrong. So there's plenty of examples of that in agriculture, and the one we're looking at is mulesing, and a lot of people think it's wrong, but it's one of the best ways, or the best way, to protect animals, the sheep, from getting fly strike if they're likely to get it. So that's why it's an ethical issue, because it's not outlawed, but some people think it's wrong. Welfare issues. So this is more to do with the law and also looking after just the well-being of the animal. So welfare relates to the state of well-being of the animal in question, and it basically looks at the care and quality of the animal in relation to their physical and behavioural needs. And then lastly, legal issues, which is the other dot point. And this is obviously derived from law and what's permitted to be done and not done. And so when it comes to mulesing, mulesing is legal, but it's illegal to do it after the animal has passed 12 months old. And between 6 and 12 months, the animal has to be given anaesthetic when you are mulesing. So that's the law when it comes to doing mulesing. Of course, with welfare, farmers might actually choose to give that animal anaesthetic even when they're 1 or 2 or 3 months old when they do it, but they don't legally have to do it, but they may want to do it for the welfare of the animal. And then in terms of ethics, there's a number of places that won't take Australian wool if it's been mulesed. So, for example, the European Union ethically is against the practice of mulesing, and so they won't take wool from Australia that's been mulesed, and we'll look at that later as well. So to be good, first of all, to have a look at this video here, if you haven't already, it just explains mulesing practice. And basically mulesing, here's a diagram of the back of a sheep, and this is what we call the breech area. And this is the area kind of shaded here where the skin will be cut off when the animal is young. Often they'll do this practice when the lamb's being marked at kind of between 2 and 2 months old, something like that, 2 to 12 weeks old. And they'll be given an ear tag. Their tail will be docked, taken off, and they might be mules. It's important to note here that farmers won't mulese animals just for the fun of it. They'll only do it in a certain number of situations. Basically, the animals that are likely to get it are typically merinos. They're in areas where there's going to be a fair bit of warmth and enough moisture, and in those situations, the farmers might mulese their animals, but it's certainly not something that every farmer does. It's something that some farmers do, and they don't just do it for fun, or they don't do it because just for the sake of it, but they're doing it to protect their animals from getting fly strike. And as we've seen earlier, fly strike is a pretty bad disease, and the effect on the sheep is terrible. And you can see here that it says it's a major problem in Australia. It causes inflammation, toxemia, and even death. And so 3 million sheep a year die in Australia as a result of fly strike, and that's out of 70 million sheep that we have. So that's a lot of sheep that are affected and are killed by fly strike. So it's a major problem, and the cost to the industry is about 280 million. If you work out that the lamb and wool industry is worth about $5-6 billion in Australia, that's a fairly high percentage, 5-6% or so of the industry. So you can actually prevent fly strike without doing mulesing potentially, but nothing is quite as successful as mulesing. And so if you regularly surveil the animals, crutching insecticides, that can keep fly strike away, but it's not as effective, and you need to regularly look after the animals, which may not happen in Australia because there's so many sheep run over such a large area. Crutching involves a lot of labour, and insecticides is a lot of cost as well, whereas mulesing is cheap, effective, and it only needs to be done once. So it can be prevented in other ways, but mulesing, as I said here, provides lifelong protection for the animals. So that is important. Okay, so what is mulesing and why is it performed? It's a surgical removal of skin from the breech area of a sheep. It's the wool-bearing skin, so once it's been removed, this area no longer produces wool, and it no longer has as many wrinkles here. And it removes skin folds from the area once the scar heals, and it stops the Lucilia caprina fly, removes the environment for the animal to lay eggs and the maggots to develop. And so the animals that you're going to typically mules are ones that are in a high risk area. They're typically merinos, and they're ones that are going to be farmed as adults and not used for their meat when they're quite young, but they're going to be around for a while to produce wool. And so we're going to look at the ethical side of this here. So for the first dot point, so we're looking at the debate, the questions, the discussion, and the views and the way forward. So firstly, the Vet Association says that the short-term welfare is compromised when you're mulesing an animal. Obviously, they experience a fair bit of pain in the time when it's done in the immediate short term. And it says here, the short-term welfare is compromised to benefit the overall long-term welfare of the animal. So the vets can clearly see that there is an overall benefit. The benefit is better than the short-term pain. So that's what makes it kind of still used, because it is the most effective way of preventing fly strike. And fly strike is far worse than the pain that is going to occur just by mulesing them. And so researchers have found that basically of all of the things that happen when lambs get marked, the ear tagging, the tail docking, etc., mulesing, if it happens, is by far the greatest stress on the animals and pain. So it's something that producers don't want to do just for the sake of it or just for fun, or they don't really want to do it unless it's absolutely necessary, because getting fly strike is far worse than getting mulesed. So this doesn't mean, though, that it shouldn't be considered. It needs to be something that's weighed up by the farmer, and this is why there is an ethical debate, because it is very good, very effective, but it does cause a lot of pain. And so the questions around it are, is it the best way to prevent fly strike? How effective is it? And what are the viable alternatives? So there are alternatives, which we've already talked a bit about: chemicals, breeding animals with less wrinkles, but it still occurs. And mulesing clips, which you'll be able to see down here, these clips that are put on the back area of the sheep, kind of try to do the same thing as mulesing, but they're not as effective because they fall off, they cost more money, they sometimes don't work, so it's not as effective. So at the moment, there's not any easy alternatives that are super effective anywhere near what mulesing is. And so the question is, how much pain are the sheep in, and should we really be breeding merinos in Australia? On one hand, the merinos produce excellent wool, but does that outweigh the kind of pain and suffering from getting fly strike? And so it's important to look at the views for and against. And basically, watch this video here for the against point of view. PETA, or People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. Pink, the singer, did a bit of a campaign for PETA against mulesing and the pain that the animals were put in. And so that's kind of a view against it. But then there's a video here on Farm Advisor about farmers showing why they need to do it. And it's interesting here to note on the ethical side that Pink, although she was originally against it, she did come out a few years later and say, actually, once you see animals suffering from fly strike, it's actually probably better that they get mulesed if it's effective. And so she kind of recanted or took back her position. So that's an interesting point here that there's different views. There's, I guess, genuine concern on both sides, and that's why it's an ethical issue. It's not illegal to do mulesing. You have to follow certain procedures, which we're about to look at shortly. But it's an ethical issue for this reason, because some people find it wrong. Some people find it something they don't like, but other people, like farmers in particular, see it as protecting their animals and stopping them from suffering in the long term. Okay, so in terms of the way forward, it's slow progress towards an alternative. At the moment, we don't really have a super viable, super cost-effective alternative. So at the moment, mulesing is probably the best way to control fly strike. And so we need to kind of focus on reducing the pain and stress that each animal is caused. And maybe that means giving them anesthetic when it's done at young age to stop the pain as badly. All right, next we're moving into the next dot point, which is welfare. And this one's quite specific about how we reduce the negative welfare effects from mulesing. Now, these 4 things, 1, 2, 3, 4, are actually listed in the dot point. And so when you get asked about this a question on these dot points often comes up. And when you get asked about these questions, or a question on this to do with welfare, it's really important that you use these 4 things, or a couple of them, depending on how much the question is worth. So these headings are important. So how can we actually make mulesing better for the animal? The first one is using appropriate equipment. So for example, if you're using shears like this, you want to make sure they're sharp and clean to stop infection from occurring. You want to use anesthetic, but it's only legally required after 6 months age, which we'll look at shortly. Using antibacterial to prevent infection, having high hygiene standards to lower the chance of infection, which will reduce the negative welfare effects. The next point, skill of the operator. So it's important and recommended, it's not legally required, but it is recommended that the person that does it is trained properly and has done some kind of course and learnt how to do it in the best way to minimize the pain to the animal and the suffering. So this is important skill of the operator. The next one, timing the practice. It's preferable to do it when the animal is younger at landmarking. So they're getting tail docking, vaccination, ear tagging, all that stuff's happening at once. And they're going to be in a bit of pain at that time, but it's kind of getting it out of the way and getting it done at the same time. And when they're that age, 2 to 12 weeks, it's reducing the additional handling and stress. They're not getting kind of constantly having something done to them every week for a couple of weeks and, looking forward to or not looking forward to that happening again. It's just happening in one go and it's over. And it reduces the longest term stress to the animal by doing it in one go. And also around that younger age, it's believed that they tend to feel pain a bit less because their nervous system is a little bit less developed than when it is older. So to limit the chance of infection, it should be performed in the cooler months. Obviously, with added heat comes the chance of more infection and disease. So doing it in cooler months is better. And it will also help decrease the heat stress while the animal's recovering. The last method of reducing negative welfare impact of mulesing is management of the animal after practice. So the animals should be mothered up, which means kept with their mother, and that reduces their stress if they can be with their mother and looked after by them. And also you want to keep them in a small contained paddock nearby where you can check them regularly to make sure that there's no infection occurring. And also you don't want the lambs kind of running around too much and kind of potentially opening up the wound that has just been healing. So you want to have restricted movement, antibacterial on the wound, mothering up, access to food, water and shade, regularly monitoring them and have them vaccinated to reduce the chance of infection. And so other ways that we can help improve the welfare is it should only be carried out when it's clearly in the best interest. So you don't just do it always for the sake of it. And that means when the chance of them getting fly strike is pretty high. The second point is breech wrinkles have now been included in EBVs for sheep. And so we already know about EBVs, but they've now been included in EBVs. So we can actually choose animals and we can measure their breech wrinkle amount. And so the less breech wrinkle they have, the less chance they have of getting fly strike. So that's important as well. And so other alternatives include breech clips, which we have here, and also injections in the under the skin to kill the maggots when they are laid, or to stop the flies from laying them there. Both of them reduce pain, but they're not as successful as mulesing. And so there's also new pain relief methods which are being developed, so the pain relief is cheaper and prevents the pain more effectively. The last dot point here is on legislation and what farmers are actually legally required to do when it comes to sheep in general, but also when it comes to mulesing and welfare. And so I've discussed here some of the laws around mulesing, but also I've discussed some of the general laws around keeping sheep, for example, in schools. And if you go to the New South Wales schoolanimals.com website, you'll see all the animals that schools keep listed, and you can click on the animal, and you can choose. I'll just show you this here. So this is the New South Wales School Animals website, Animals in Schools, and you can go to choose the different animals down here. And so I chose sheep, and then it tells you a bit about the laws that are required to be followed when you keep animals in sheep. And when you click on environment, food and water, transport, etc., it tells you what the law is in red here about what we have to do, what we're required to do when keeping sheep at school. And if we don't do that, if you are negligent towards animals, you can be arrested in the same way as being negligent towards humans. You can be arrested, and you can face trial for neglecting animals' welfare. So for example, here it says each pen must be designed to hold no more than 4 sheep and must provide an area of at least 2.25 square meters per sheep. So that's an example down here. But let's have a look first at mulesing. And the question is really about the law. Is the law protecting the sheep in the best way? Is the practice wrong? Should it be outlawed completely? And then who's going to be responsible for looking after it? And the RSPCA is often the organisation that looks after the welfare of animals. They might get called out to properties, and people can be arrested for mistreating animals potentially. So in terms of laws, currently mulesing is legal everywhere in Australia under all state and territory laws, and it needs to be done with certain kind of conditions though. There are laws about what you can and can't do, and at the moment it's still going to be legal for quite a while, I think, until we come up with an alternative that's better. And so current codes of practice state that mulesing must not be done on sheep that are older than 12 months of age, and anaesthetic must be used when mulesing sheep older than 6 months. So it's illegal to mule sheep over 12 months of age, and between 6 and 12 months, it has to have anaesthetic. Now, you don't have to give a sheep anaesthetic 0 to 6 months when you're doing it. However, a lot of farmers may choose to do that because they want to look after the welfare of their animal more than what the law requires, but it's certainly not illegal to do so 0 to 6 months without an anaesthetic at this stage. And so the law only recommends that people mulesing are accredited to do so. However, anyone can legally do it. In terms of other laws about sheep and keeping them in schools, each sheep needs 2.25 square meters, as we mentioned before. Feed bins must be off the floor and cleaned regularly. You have to keep the normal pattern of day and night lighting conditions, so they can't just be kept in light conditions 24 hours a day. All sheep entering and moving in New South Wales must have an NLIS device, and lice-infected sheep cannot be moved except for slaughter. Now, there's a lot of other laws as well around sheep, but they are just a couple of examples. And if you don't do those regularly, consistently, you can, the result of not looking after animal welfare is you can be arrested eventually because you are breaking the law. And so, in conclusion with all this, mulesing can cause market damage. So it reduces the market that we can sell to because international retailers such as H&M, Adidas, Hugo Boss, etc. have decided to stop using wool from mule sheep because it's an ethical issue. It's also a welfare issue and a legal issue in different ways. But the ethical nature of this means that some people disagree with it, and so they've decided to take a stand and say that they won't buy wool from sheep that have been mulesed. And so failing to kind of meet a deadline, Australia kind of agreed to try and phase out mulesing a few years ago. We haven't managed to do that yet, but if we keep putting it off and not coming up with alternatives, it might mean that less and less places want to buy our wool. So it's quite important, not just we don't want to get rid of mulesing just because of the pain it causes, because it is quite successful at removing the fly strike problem. But one of probably the thing that might end up causing it to have to be stopped as a practice is the fact that more and more places might choose to stop buying our wool. So past HSC questions, there's often questions that come up on this. So which of the following best describes the purpose of animal welfare legislation in animal production systems? To ensure that farm animals have adequate food. That might be part of it, but it's not the purpose of it. To eliminate all sources of pain and suffering. Well, you can't possibly eliminate all sources of pain and suffering. And so welfare legislation does not try to eliminate all sources of pain and suffering. But the answer is to promote the well-being of animals and prevent cruelty to them. So you want to minimize the pain and suffering, but you can't eliminate all of it. And then lastly, to prevent animal rights activists from interfering in farming activities. That's obviously not the purpose of welfare legislation. It is actually to promote the well-being of the animals and prevent cruelty to them. The question 25 here from 2016, for a named animal production system, describe ways that stress or harm the animal is minimized. This is important here. This dot point says, or this question, says when performing 2 animal husbandry practices. However, you'll notice in the dot point that it says only 1. It asks you to look at impacts of using these things, carrying out a particular husbandry practice. Now, it says in the dot point you only need to know 1, but a mistake was made in the HSC question last year where they asked for 2. And technically that's not in the syllabus, so they should really have only asked for 1. But I went on and answered 2 anyway. You don't need to stress about needing to know 2 because this was a mistake, this question, and it shouldn't be, the same mistake won't be made again because you can only be asked about 1 because there's only 1 in the syllabus. But like I said, the question said 2, so I went and did 2 for you, but you certainly don't need to know a second one. So for sheep and mulesing, a number of methods can be used to minimize stress harm. Mentioning these things, one of the 4 things that was mentioned before in the dot point, a skilled operator should be used as they know how to minimize pain and complete practice effectively. Also, the lambs can be closely monitored after practice in small pens with their mothers to ensure less stress and wounds do not get infected. The next one, tail docking, is another practice which can cause pain potentially. So using appropriate equipment, such as a very sharp knife, will allow the practice to occur more quickly, therefore less pain. And in terms of timing of the practice, it should be done at lamb marking when the animal is young, has less nerves, and the tail is thinner and can be taken off while causing less pain. So the 2013 question was the purpose of legislation, welfare legislation, and industry codes of practice, and to reduce unnecessary pain and suffering is correct. To improve the quality of animal products, that's not the purpose. To ensure that the latest technologies are used, that's not the purpose. And to allow farm managers to monitor performance is also not the purpose. The last 2 questions here, A and B from 2013, outline one ethical issue related to animal production. And so mulesing is an ethical issue as it is seen as causing excessive pain to an animal, and many people believe it to be cruel. However, it's also highly effective at preventing fly strike, which is why it is more of an ethical subjective issue rather than being outlawed. And B, name an animal husbandry practice and describe how its potential negative effects can be reduced. So mulesing is surgical removal of wool-bearing skin from the breech area of a sheep to prevent fly strike. So I've actually gone into a bit more detail about it than just naming it, but that's okay. So reducing negative effects. So correct equipment, sharp knives reduces pain as it's quicker. Timing of practice done when it's 2 to 12 weeks, less nerve, less pain. And lastly, management after practice, closely monitor to watch for infection and allow mothering up to reduce stress. So they're clearly describing some ways of reducing the negative effects of mulesing.